Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Serious moves are afoot to allow ending the lives of dementia patients, either by allowing them to be killed by lethal jab, if requested, or to allow a document to be signed requiring caregivers to withhold sufficient food and water so that they get starved and dehydrated to death. New Jersey seems to move subtly in the latter direction with a vaguely worded bill that could open the door to intentional legal undernourishment. Wes Smith joins us, Chair and Senior Fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism, also host of the Humanized podcast. Wes, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Marcus, good to talk to you again.
It's always good to reconnect with you, and thank you for being at the forefront of these issues. The horror behind this, Wes, is what's concerning. Okay, so I think before we talk about the issue proper, just so our listeners can get reacquainted with the context, when you undernourish a patient, a dementia patient or an elderly patient, it's a painful way to die. There's nothing dignified or easy or painless about it.
Well, let's set some definitions which I think are important. A lot of times when people are dying, say of cancer, or as my mother, and when she died of dementia in my wife's and my home, at some point they stop eating. That's a natural process. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to force feed people whose bodies are shutting down and they can no longer acclimate and digest the food. That's not what we're talking about. We are talking about either withholding food and water from people who can assimilate food and water, or intentionally undernourishing those who can. And that's because there is a real move afoot, as you mentioned in the start of this interview, to make dementia patients die sooner rather than later. And I call it a search and destroy mission, because people are understandably afraid of having Alzheimer's and so forth. But the idea that if someone gets Alzheimer's, we should take away food and water, if you did that to a dog, you'd go to jail. These are people. They are of equal moral worth. And a lot of times, and this was true with my mother, one of the joys she still had in life was eating and drinking. I remember at one point, if I might be allowed a personal anecdote, I had a visiting nurse who had been visiting with my mother for a couple of years. And my mother had stopped eating, and I was offering her food, and she just wouldn't eat. And Helen, who was just this angel, came over with some canned peaches. She opened the canned peaches, and my mother wolfed them down and had such great enjoyment out of them. And I thought, all right, Mom, you're going to eat canned peaches, So what I don't understand, and I do understand, but I think it's wrong, that we shouldn't give people as much as they want, as opposed to saying we're going to allow you to have only so much as so that you don't feel famished. And by the way, we may also give you medication to prevent you from feeling these things so that you die in weeks or days, weeks, or instead of months or years.
Okay, so let's talk about what's going on in New Jersey. Tell us about SB 4186.
Right. There's a bioethicist named Thaddeus Mason Pope, who is really pushing this agenda, and he travels the world. He's very successful. He's on, Twitter, everything. And he has been helping to write these proposals. And this bill, SB 4186, would legalize comfort feeding only. In other words, and I'll quote from the legislation, comfort feeding only means an order that directs caregivers to offer oral food and fluids by hand if and as tolerated for comfort purposes, not for sustenance purposes, and prohibits artificial nutrition or hydration, that's a feeding tube, or intravenous means. So we're not talking about force feeding people. We're not talking about feeding tubes. Those are medical treatments that people have a right to refuse in law. We are talking about denying people proper humane care. What is humane care? It's not medical treatment. Spoon feeding a patient who can't feed themselves doesn't require a medical license. I did it with my mother. I don't have a medical license. If you needed a medical license, maybe I should go to jail, right? Instead, it is the same thing as keeping warm, the same kind of category, keeping clean, and turning to make sure that there aren't bed sores and this kind of thing. And what they're talking about is having people who are really afraid of dementia sign directives forcing caregivers under law to undernourish. And I don't think anybody has a right to do that to anyone, regardless of how they might feel about living with dementia.
Can you please talk about how this vague definition of comfort feeding only can allow for, well, eventually, the withdrawal of food and drink that can sustain the life of the patient?
Well, because if the patient doesn't indicate, I'm sorry about my dog barking there. If the patient doesn't indicate, great. Live radio, Marcus. If the patient doesn't indicate that they're hungry, then they won't get anything. And what if they've been given a sedative?
Yeah.
So that they can't state that they're hungry, as opposed to, being brought meals at a regular time. And that could actually make it so that people who would want to eat don't get to eat. And so what we're talking about here is, we don't have objections to refusing medical treatment. People have a right to do that, but you shouldn't seek to hasten deaths. You shouldn't intend people to die sooner rather than later. The proper thing is to care for people based on their needs at the time. If they say they don't want to eat, you don't force them to eat. But if they willingly eat, you don't limit what they can take.
Now, again, to go back to the point you made earlier, we are also therefore, like exactly what you just said, prohibit forced feeding. That's completely acceptable ethically.
Absolutely.
But that's not what we're talking about here.
Right. So people, a lot of times, in fact, I notice when I write about this issue, people get confused. As I said, sometimes people stop eating and drinking as a natural part of the dying process. You don't want to force sustenance on people that can't assimilate that food and water. That would be cruel. But when people can eat, when they can assimilate, when they willingly eat, why would you restrict the amount of food and water that they can have? That is cruel. And that, to me, is inhumane. And if you did it, as I said, to an animal, you'd probably go to jail. I mean, if your dog got sick and you said, well, I'm going to make my dog die by undernourishment, the Humane Society would be after you.
That's exactly right. If we held these standards to certain animals, especially those classified as endangered, particular individuals and whole societies and institutions would come after us. And so the double standard when it comes to human life is really palpable here.
So what they really want, Marcus, in my view, is to authorize the lethal injection. The answer to what I just said is, well, we put animals down. So why make people extend over a long period of time when we can give them a lethal jab? That's what they do in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, you can sign a directive saying, if I become incompetent, kill me, and doctors will kill you. That's what they are doing in Canada, and that's what they're doing in Belgium, and I think that's where all this is headed. This kind of, we'll undernourish is kind of a way station until we can get to full-born euthanasia.
And that's exactly where this is going to end, because this legislation is written just ambiguously enough that future legislation will solidify that deal.
Sure, and once people get acclimated to making people die and making sure they live shorter periods of time rather than longer, then let's make it as efficient as possible. Let's make it as, quote, humane, close quote, as possible. Why drag it out? Let's just get it over with. And that's the abandonment of patients. It's also terrible for caregivers to force them to underfeed and undernourish people.
Yeah. Well, Wes, as usual, thank you very much for making the time to talk with us about this.
Thank you, Marcus.
My guest has been Wes Smith. He is Senior Fellow and Chair at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. And we've been talking about New Jersey Bill 4186 that will allow for the deliberate undernourishment of dying patients. I'm Marcus Peter.